Good morning, friends. Today, in our walk through Mark, we are in chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. Five fairly short verses that are packed with action and packed with meaning and packed with mission. I've titled this little segment, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And it's a story within these five consecutive conflicts now with the religious leaders. If I can review the four main sets of characters in Mark's story are Jesus as the main character, the disciples, those who are following him, the religious leaders, and the crowds. And now, in this section from chapter 2, verse 1 through chapter 3, verse 6, we see five consecutive conflicts between Jesus and the religious leaders. Jesus is bringing this new message of the kingdom with authoritative teaching and miraculous power to bear in his beloved nation that he's been promised to. And in this second of the five conflicts, we're going to see how the religious leaders react when Jesus does life with undesirables. It's a very important lesson for us. So I've called it "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner?" And one of the people at dinner in this story is actually a tax man. And it's interesting that we come to this segment here on April the 14th, because typically in our usual flow, we will see that April 15th is a day that we all typically dread and must do business with ourselves, because that is when we pay the tax man his due. And just as in this day, we kind of loathe the tax man, in first century Israel, the taxmen were absolutely hated. They were they were disdained and despised, and I'll explain more of that in a second. And so, in this second of five conflicts, we see the development of Mark's story as Jesus is continuing to express himself as this unique, this sui generis, this one of a kind, given to first his nation and then broadcast to the world as the kingdom has broken in to our lives. And so let me just read through the text, and I'm going to stop along the way in these five verses that are packed with action and packed with meaning for us. Verse 13 of chapter 2. Now, Jesus is still teaching in the northern part of Israel and in the lake, in the Sea of Galilee area in Capernaum, and he's got a home there. Once again, the text says, Jesus went out beside the lake, and again, a large crowd came to him and he began to teach along. And he's probably walking along teaching. There are people following, there are people who are surrounding. He passes a tax collector's booth. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. Now, this man, Levi, is a Jew, and a Jew who took the role of tax collector, exacting taxes from his own people in order to pay Rome, was someone who was seen as a traitor, as a betrayer. He was someone who should have been committed to Israel's cause in being free from the Romans, but instead he was seen as a collaborator helping to extract resources, extract taxes, and sometimes exorbitantly, and sometimes lining his own pockets. Tax collectors were seen as some of the most corrupt people in the nation in the relationship between the Jews and the Roman dominators. They were seen as someone who was a collaborator and a betrayer and an extorter of money from his own people. And so this was a guy who was an undesirable in the eyes of the nation and particularly in the eyes of the religious leader. Now, there are religious leaders who are now in this group that Jesus is teaching. And they are there not necessarily because they're going, "Oh, teach me, teacher." They are there because they are under a growing suspicion that this man is someone that has to be dealt with and dealt with decisively and dealt with forcefully in order for them to protect in their own broadcast of agenda to protect the law and the nation of Israel. But truly, we see their motives begin to develop that they're more interested in protecting themselves. So they are, and as Jesus walks by this tax collector's booth, it was really kind of a customs booth. There was sales taxes. There were import fees, there were export fees, especially right there along the sea, and there were just the regular taxes to collect too. This was a station to collect money. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. Now, this probably wasn't Levi's first exposure to Jesus, because Jesus had been doing life in this area, in this region. And so he was more and more compelled as he got more and more familiar with what Jesus was doing and who Jesus was. And so at this point, Jesus says, "Follow me." And he got up and left this lucrative, even though disdained and despised role, and began to follow Jesus in this crowd. And so Jesus goes in to dinner at Levi's house. And going to dinner with someone in ancient Near Eastern culture is different than us going to dinner casually today at some neighbor or some friend's house with another group of people. I'll explain more in a minute. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. And when the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, so that's one of the segments of the religious leaders. There were scribes, there were Pharisees, there were teachers of the law, there was the Sanhedrin, there was the Sadducees, there were all these sects within the broad category of religious leader. Now these are lawyers and Pharisees. A Pharisee is someone who was a protector of Israel's tradition, really more even than being an expert in the law. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw Jesus eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" Now, this is so important to realize what's going on here. In our last segment yesterday, where we had the religious leaders, Jesus proves his authority over sin by healing the paralytic. And now, having shown his authority to forgive sin, Jesus now enters in to this house environment where there are opportunities to call sinners. So, having shown his authority over sin, Mark deems it appropriate to now develop the reality that Jesus calls sinners to be forgiven. Since Jesus can forgive sin, he calls sinners to be forgiven, and he does that in their proximity. Now, to be at dinner in the ancient Near East meant more than just going in for a bite and having a good meal and maybe yucking it up. It was literally a commitment to relationship. Uh, in the ancient Near East, hospitality was commanded. And when you showed hospitality, you were communicating to the people that you were with that you were interested in them at the deepest levels of intimacy. It was truly a commitment to join and engage in a relationship. I wrote it this way: Jesus' acceptance of table fellowship with these outcasts conveyed by action the forgiveness that he was willing to grant them. He gave forgiveness verbally in our first story, where he says to the paralytic, "Your sins are forgiven," and then proves that in the physical by saying, "Take up your bed and walk." But here, he conveyed by action, just entering into the proximity of these outcasts, these people who were disdained and despised by the religious leaders. Jesus goes in and shows his commitment to them. And by his proximity and by his engagement with table fellowship, so important for us to understand, he is expressing in his physical presence and his willingness to engage his desire for them now to be called into forgiveness as well. Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners, the Pharisees disciples? On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick." And here's Jesus's mission statement: "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And that's the end of this little segment. And there's so much here. There's several things that are very important. And I'm going to point out a few of them. And then I'm going to talk to this supposed categorization of people. the righteous who don't need a doctor, the sick who don't need a physician. And spiritually, Jesus says these are the righteous. And then there's the sick who need a physician. There's the unrighteous or the sinners that need forgiveness. So, since Jesus is the forgiver of sins, he beckons sinners to be forgiven. To call sinners to be forgiven, it's best to be in proximity and in relationship. These are all things that are appropriately connected to this story and we can learn from. Now, this is kind of the meat of our teaching today. Jesus' last statement: it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. So we could glean, we could take away from Jesus' statement that there are people who don't need him, and they would be the healthy spiritually or the righteous. And then there are those who do need Jesus, and those would be the sick spiritually or the sinners. And our tendency might be to form these categories and then place ourselves over here in the spiritually healthy, the righteous who don't need Jesus. And I can see how that might be a move that you'd like to make, that we'd like to make. At the balance of the biblical text, you realize that Jesus is not saying, in actuality, there's a group of righteous without him, spiritually healthy without him, without need of forgiveness. And then there's another category in need of forgiveness that he can provide. What Jesus is saying is that people typically understand one or two things about themselves, and one is deception, and one is reality. If I say I have no need of Jesus because I'm a good person and I'm righteous, then I'm self deceived just based on the reality of the biblical text. And I would say just on honest observation of my own behavior, my own attitudes, my own selfishness, and what I see around me in the form of moral evil. But if I say that I am healthy and do not need a doctor, if I say that I am righteous without Jesus' forgiveness, then I am in the category of self deceived. And this is what Jesus is saying. You see it throughout his ministry, throughout the four stories about his life, when he prevalent and most common. And then there's the category of honest observers of their own condition. See, I eat with sinners every day. I eat with the unrighteous every day. When I eat a meal by myself, I'm eating with a sinner. Jesus is saying, I have come and I call those who recognize their need. Those who don't recognize their need will see no need for me. And he encapsulates this story and his mission statement in this story, uh, that it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick, and the sinners are called because they recognize their need. They recognize the call. Sinners who won't acknowledge sin are nonetheless sinners. Sinners who won't acknowledge their sin and deceive themselves as righteous and without need are nonetheless sinners. In Luke chapter 18, starting in verse 9, Jesus says, in this same context, with the same kinds of religious leaders, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. Now, this is the exact scene that's going on here as the Pharisees disdain and despise these outcasts. They're looking down on them and placing themselves in that healthy and without need category. To some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable, this story, this earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. Now there are Pharisees in this setting, there are Pharisees listening to him. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and one a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like the other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. I'm righteous. I'm a doer of good. I have no need. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, there are those two people personified in this parable that we read about in this second conflict between Jesus and the religious leaders. They are those who see themselves as righteous and have no need, and therefore that self righteousness and that judgmentalism looks down in condemnation on everybody else. And then there are those who honestly acknowledge their need for mercy because of their sin. Jesus closes the parable with this: I tell you that the tax collector, rather than the Pharisee, went home justified, which means in good standing, in honest relationship before God. And this is how Jesus summarizes again. Those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So as we close out our teaching time today, there's a few things I want to refresh. One is that we who understand and acknowledge our sin and have received mercy and justification through Jesus Christ and now are in good standing with God, we have a mission to do life and hospitality and engage with those who need that same forgiveness and mercy. Uh, to call sinners to forgiveness, it's necessary to be in their proximity. Are you in relationship with people who are in deep need of the mercy and grace that Jesus Christ provides? What I've seen as a tendency is that church people have a tendency to, over time, actually remove themselves from relationship with most and form these little holy huddles and cliques where the kingdom cannot be expressed outwardly and the kingdom cannot be breached externally from the outside. And I think finally, just the recognition that an honest evaluation of my standing before God is that without Jesus Christ, I am undone. And I need to be not the self-righteous man, thanking God that I'm not like the other people. I need to be like the most outcast of the outcast and recognize in humility that without God's grace and mercy, I am undone. Which camp did you find yourself in this morning? Thanking God for his mercy and grace, or still assured of your goodness and righteousness in and of yourself? We'll continue our walk through